Good morning, I'm Oswald San. Welcome to another edition of Family Matters brought to you by MAPS and your radio 102.9. Today we have the pleasure to have Kim from the Y. Of course, this is the third of our three-part series with Kim, who's been just an enormous fountain of information for us. So, Kim, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you.
As you may know, over the last two shows, we have talked about youth at risk. We have spoken about services for women. And today, we want to talk about the homeless and at risk of homeless population with Kim. Kim, of course, has been with the Y for a number of years as their executive director. She's also been the ED for the Boys and Girls Club and the Crisis Center as well. So we have Kim has a lot of experience in this area. So Kim, welcome again, and let's just start right in on this. When we talk about homeless or at the risk of being homeless, it seems like a fairly general title. What are we really talking about when we talk about that group?
Yeah, and I think often, when people think of homelessness, they think of that street homeless, the visual homeless. And homelessness is so much bigger than that. Unstable housing, overcrowded housing, couch surfing, not being able to find housing, those types of things. So homelessness is a lot larger. We talked about it a little bit under youth homelessness because there is a large population of youth that are homeless, primarily couch surfing or staying with friends. If I was to think of one kind of word that would describe homelessness, in my opinion, it would be just lack of an unstable housing. So
Okay.
you could be housed, but it could be unstable housing. You could have 12 people in, a 3-bedroom apartment. That's unstable, right? You could be on the verge of eviction.
Yes.
That's unstable housing. And particularly in Thompson, because there isn't a whole lot of housing available, right? We have a lot of people that are in unstable situations or at risk of becoming homeless. Not to negate the fact that obviously street homeless is the visual kind of homeless. People often, they struggle with addictions often on the street, mental health issues, but so do people that are at risk of homelessness. That's why they're at risk of homelessness.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that because just a few weeks ago I was dealing with one lady and her son who was under enormous stress because they were in an apartment that the rent had just been increased significantly, and she was under enormous stress. She was being given eviction notice. She was being, phone calls, and there's no doubt that she was just at her wit's end. So I understand, especially in Thompson, where we've had a number of occasions over years where apartments have been upgraded and rents have been increased by a fair margin, and at times it just it's a lot larger than the people who are in there are able to pay. And as a result, yes, they do have to find other
Yeah, it's
accommodations.
when we talk about, the availability of housing in Thompson, right? There is not a huge poll or a huge that they can draw from when we're talking about, lower income people or even middle income people, individuals looking for housing. It's difficult in Thompson because you're right. Lots of our stock was, bought up from outside investors, upgraded, and then the rent becomes unattainable. And so we don't have a whole lot of options for people. That's how we find ourselves in situations of people living in substandard housing,
Right.
overcrowded housing. You know, people think it doesn't exist in Thompson. Like,
Yeah.
often if I'm talking to people, they talk about the outerlying communities, being in overcrowded situations. You'd be surprised at how many overcrowding homes are in Thompson because there's a lack of housing. And the other thing that plays into that, we're probably already halfway through our time now, but
No. Oh
is
no.
there's a huge amount of stigma when we're dealing with the homeless population and trying to look at housing options for homeless, because there is a stigma automatically attached to homeless people that
Right.
they're all addicts, which is untrue, that they all suffer from mental health, which is untrue. Often it's just a series of misfortunate events that have led some people to be homeless.
Well, and actually that leads into our next question, because when we talk about the demographic profile of groups that, from what you've seen over years, tends to be overrepresented in the homeless or at risk of being homeless, uh, what would you say that group looks like? You talked about people with addictions. Any other groups that you can state that tends to be overrepresented in that homeless or at-risk homeless population?
Well, definitely, because we've talked about it in other sessions that we have had. Definitely women that are suffering from domestic violence situations,
Mm-hmm.
they're overrepresented. Youth, right? Even though it's kind of hidden. So and then of course, we live in northern Manitoba, and we are a primary indigenous community in the north. So, a large amount of the homeless are indigenous.
Yeah. And you know what? Going back to the first question, when you talk about how there seems to be kind of a smaller view of what a homeless population is. Do you feel that due to that disconnect between the actual people that are at risk with the general population's view, has that seeped its way into our current policies where at times there's not enough focus on that broader issue versus just the narrow part that, when it comes to homeless population, we're talking people at the homeless shelter or people that we see on the streets. Has that affected, you think, the access to resources?
Well, I think, yeah, I think the short answer is yes, but of course there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes under that. There has been a huge focus on the street, the street homeless population, because that's a visual, and that's typically what the community is going to bring forth concerns about, is the street homeless.
Right.
But that's not to say that we haven't done work in other areas of people at risk of homeless, youth homelessness, women and children that become homeless. And if we just think about initiatives that have taken place over the years, such as transition homes setting up, they aren't targeted for street homeless. They're for anyone that's homeless,
Right.
any experience. But I do agree that our primary focus has been a lot of the street homeless, the visual homeless, and particularly during COVID, right? We seen a huge amount of effort kind of go into the street homeless. And if we talk about COVID, I'm not a doctor, but I always think an overcrowded home is much worse in terms of spreading COVID than a person that's on the street,
Right.
right?
Yeah. And it's interesting with the dynamics of not just Thompson, but any of the urban centers, whether it's the PA or Thompson or Flin Flon, that when we have overcrowded situations in communities outside of these urban centers, that's part of the factors that drive people into Thompson or into the PA, because they don't at times have the appropriate housing situation. But when it comes to the homeless population, and this is just a side question, do you feel that there's enough discussions between, say, these urban centers and some of the outlining communities to try and get their members back into their First Nation or into their community, rather than having them be on the streets of Thompson? Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say, there is efforts like that
Yeah.
happen, particularly with organizations that work directly with the homeless population, the street homeless primarily.
Right.
So even at the Y with our SHIP program or our transition program, if a client identifies that they want to return home to their home community, there's a lot of effort that goes into assisting that client to connect back to their community. So we do that quite often at the Y. I know that the homeless shelter downtown also does that, as well as 95 Cree.
Right.
Could it be a bigger effort? Could we be more coordinated? Absolutely. I think that we could get into more of the at-risk homeless or those overcrowding situations for those that want to return back to the community.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
I think COVID, again, not to bring the focus onto COVID, but COVID really heightened the need to have more coordinated effort, right? In terms of helping people return home, because what was happening at the height of COVID, the height of the third wave, is people were stranded here because they needed to isolate for 14 days prior to going home.
Yeah.
Well, if you're homeless or if you live in an overcrowded house, how do you isolate for 14 days to be able to return home? No ill to the community. I mean, they're trying to protect their community.
Right.
And it really heightened, and so I'll just quickly put a plug into the local CAP, the Community Advisory Group on Homelessness. I mean, they're talking about doing a coordinated access program where everybody, all the services are on this program, and so that we're better able to connect clients to what they have identified they want. I want to return home, or I want to move into housing, so that we're a little bit more coordinated, so that it's just not scatterings amongst Thompson working.
Okay, and you know what? I want to talk a little bit more about the SHIP program, one of your favorite topics. But before I do, I just want to remind everyone that you are listening to Family Matters, brought to you by MAPS and your radio station 102.9. We have Kim Hickes, the Executive Director of the YWCA, talking to us about the homeless and at-risk of homeless population. Switching gears a bit to the SHIFT program, I believe that over the last year there may have been some unwarranted criticism of that program, feeling that at times it has driven up some of the things we see with the homeless population. Can you go into details on your thoughts about how effective that program has been?
Well, definitely, as as an executive director of the Y, and day in and day out of running this program, we're actually, by March we would have been running this program for 2 years. It was
Sorry, and SHIP stands for, just to make sure everyone is clear on it.
Yeah, so SHIP is Sheltering Homeless in Place project.
Right.
It was a direct COVID-19 response project, and so this was in the attempts to stop the spread of COVID throughout northern Manitoba. That was recognized super early. So what they did was they identified, 25 of the highest risk of contracting COVID and having some serious outcomes due to their medical conditions. So that's how it initially started. That program, is super successful, and when we talk about coordinating to assist clients to go home, they're able to do their 14-day isolation. But when I speak to the RCMP to see, right, are we actually making an impact? And the amount of calls for RCMP, ambulance services, or even those clients going to the hospital to get service has significantly decreased, because they have somewhere to be that's safe, that's warm. They have their dignity. They're humanized, right? And often I find that we dehumanize homelessness and not look at them as a person, as an individual. What's their journey? What's their story? Why are they in Thompson? Why wouldn't we dig a little deeper and have those conversations? It has been criticized. Definitely SHIP has been criticized. There are certain measures that we had to take in terms of COVID to try to encourage a more close to home approach as opposed to out and running around the community. And so there are certain policies that where people will question or criticize things like trying to encourage them to stay close to home. And we recognize that these are addicts. They require the alcohol in order to not have a significant medical event happen.
Right.
And so we try to encourage them to, have the alcohol closer to site so that they're not out running around in the community. So it often appears, that we have this big party happening outside the Y, which is untrue.
Right. Yeah, you know what? And I thought a lot about the program. I'd even go as far as saying, even if you take COVID off the table as the driving force behind the program, what's your thoughts on that program being a bit of a model as to how, going forward, we should address people who are addicts, for lack of a better word, that are part of that homeless or at risk of being homeless group?
I definitely am a fan of SHIP outside of COVID.
Right.
And anyone that knows me, every table that I've been at, definitely as long as you are balancing that program in terms of assisting clients with what goal they have identified, right? And so it's the housing first principles.
Right.
Really, at the end of the day,
Yeah.
housing first is proven to be a successful model,
Right.
as long as you have the support pieces in there to support clients and recognize that, addiction has its ups and downs and its roller coaster, and it doesn't come from a punishment place. It comes from, let's work together to see what journey we can go on to get you into housing, to get you, reduce your going to the hospital, those types of things. Navigating, sorry, Oswald, navigating those systems is hard enough on people that already have housing.
Right.
You go
Right.
try to navigate a system when you don't have ID,
Yeah.
right? You don't have nothing, so you can't even enter a bank to open a bank account.
And actually, that the housing first actually answers my last question in regards to what you see with the current gaps. And we want, just closing, I just want to talk a little bit about first of all how housing first is, just so for our audience to understand that, and how you feel it makes a mark on trying to address the homeless or at-risk homeless population.
Well, it kind of turns everything upside down because really, primarily, if we look historically, when we deal with housing, with homeless people that are, have addiction issues or mental health issues or anything like that, housing first kind of flips it because before, in order to have housing, you would need to, be sober
Have
or
a job,
functioning,
yeah.
have a job. And
Yeah.
housing first really just looks at housing somebody regardless of what whether they have an addiction, whether they have any other issues. It gives them housing first, which hence the title, housing first. And then once they have that housing, they feel more safe, they feel more secure, they develop relationships, and then they're able to start looking at what their journey looks like and what they want to continue with. What I want to say about that is, you have to have, again, I think I've said it in the last two sessions, we have to ensure that we have access to all different types of housing for people, particularly when we talk about homeless or hidden homelessness. We have to have sober living facilities, like MAPS. We have to have housing first, what they would call damp houses where people are allowed to enter those facilities intoxicated. Now, to clarify, because that's been criticized in the Thompson as well, it does not mean that they're drinking on site in their rooms.
Right.
What it means is that we recognize that we're not going to punish them for being an addict. We're not going to punish them for being intoxicated. There are standards or expectations of entering the facility if you are intoxicated. So, for instance, SHIP, right?
Yes.
If you enter the facility intoxicated, the expectation is you go directly to your room. There's no interactions with other people because you're intoxicated and there's other people in the building, right? And so those guidelines kind of guide that housing first kind of damp house model, right? I think there's lots of confusion on what harm reduction looks like, what housing first is. There's some, assumptions that means drinking in your room and getting intoxicated right in your room.
Yeah, and you know what? In closing, I would say that's probably our main challenge right now is trying to clarify what programs are there for and what their focus is, because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. That's why we have you on the show here to help clarify. It's been great talking to Kim here, the executive director for the YWCA. I would say that there's a good chance we will have her back again. In fact, I was trying to talk to her about become my co-host for Family Matters would be great. It's great having a person that has the depths of experience and knowledge that you do have on these various topics that are not just facing Thompson, but actually Northern Manitoba, because we are seeing the trend lines, right? We are seeing that these challenges are not going away. If anything, they are increasing, and we need to have proactive programs in place. I would say with the SIP program, that's a great example of a proactive program that I feel that there should be some good lobbying to keep that in place even after COVID, because I totally agree. It is in line with I know if some of our audience remembers Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But when you don't have to worry about being outside and freezing to death or starving to death, and you have those basic needs taken care of, that's when you have the opportunity to start to really think about where are you in life, what do you want to be doing, are you happy where you're at right now? And people, when they are under stress from trying to find a roof over their head or trying to find the next meal, let's face it, they just do not go into that line of thinking. So thank you again, Kim. Appreciate your time. And I say there's an open invite to have you back again. I know we will. You are listening to Family Matters, brought to you by MAPS and your Radio 102.9. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and see you next time. Or hear you next time. Actually, take that.